The College Board cuts our David story off with the Oath of Huarache in 1785, just before the revolution breaks out and just before David's story and France's starts getting more interesting and a whole lot bloodier. Here is another of David's French Revolution paintings, submitted to the French Academy after the National Assembly had met and called for a new constitution, and after the Paris mob stormed the Paris prison, the Bastille. I could really imagine this work, or the death of Socrates we saw earlier, showing up in an attribution question, since both paintings have a classical theme, a contemporary political message, and David's characteristic linear composition. Here again, David's classically educated viewers would have known the story. Brutus's sons had attempted to overthrow the Roman Republic and restore the monarchy, so the father ordered his own son's execution as an act of loyalty to the Republic. The message was pretty clear: be prepared to sacrifice everything for the revolution, even your near and dear. As political predictions go, this one was spot on. The tennis court oath represented an all too brief moment of national unity. In the years that followed, an increasingly radical faction took power in France, sending anyone who disagreed or even had the slightest association with the aristocracy into the deadly embrace of Madame Guillotine. David threw in with this crowd, led by Maximilien Robespierre and Jean-Paul Marat, and in fact he became their minister of propaganda. Here's a sketch that David made standing at an upstairs window watching the revolutionary troops lead Queen Marie Antoinette to the guillotine. As a member of the convention, France's ruling legislature, he had voted for her execution. After knocking off this sketch, David raced to a ceremony to unveil a work that the convention had commissioned, a tribute to one of their members, the recently assassinated Jean-Paul Marat. And this painting is a propaganda piece, one of the most brilliant in the history of art. Marat suffered from a disfiguring skin disease. In David's painting, his skin has miraculously cleared. The note that the dead Marat is clutching is not the note that the young assassin, Charlotte Corday, sent him to gain an audience. Her note contained a list of supposed traitors just begging to lose their heads. Instead, David has painted Marat clutching a letter to a poor widow, offering Marat's help and financial assistance, a letter that David made up to win more sympathy for Marat. Moreover, David has deliberately borrowed Christian imagery to convey martyrdom. The resemblance to Michelangelo's Pietà is no accident. When the head-chopping phase of the revolution ended with the execution of its leader, Robespierre, David came very close to making the personal acquaintance of Madame Guillotine. He was imprisoned, but eventually pardoned. After this near brush with death and a short period of exile, he transferred his loyalties to France's new demagogue, Napoleon, and once again took up his paintbrush in the service of propaganda. Ever obedient to his new master, David made several changes to this painting at Napoleon's request, including the painting the Pope with his hand raised in blessing, which is historically quite dubious. And get a load of this highly romanticized and highly unlikely vision of Napoleon riding a bucking horse alongside a steep precipice in the Alps. We'll leave David now, but not Napoleon. On to Goya, the Napoleonic Wars, and Romanticism. Do not panic. We will cover these points as we go along. Consider this slide your first glance at the map before that maddening Google lady's voice starts telling you where to turn. I've talked many times about how each new artistic generation likes to rebel against the older generation. Romanticism is no exception. All that emphasis on pure reason struck many artists as cold and unfeeling, especially after so many from their parents' generation who had worshipped at the altar of reason proved distressingly willing to spill a lot of blood in its name. But the call for liberty, equality, and fraternity nevertheless ignited a passion for freedom, which many romantic poets and artists interpret as not just or even as much political freedom from political tyranny as freedom from society's rules. Of course, Enlightenment thinking had already included what would prove to be a strong romantic element represented by Rousseau. But up until now, this emphasis on feeling and freedom had shown up mostly in naturalistic landscapes or in sentimental paintings of simple peasant families. Now, painters began to explore the scarier underbelly of feelings and emotions, nightmares. the macabre, monsters, beauty that was more unearthly than real, all summed up, as your homework noted, in the term sublime. Nature to the Romantics was not merely a source of beauty, it was a source of terror too, an allegory for the bestiality that humans visited on one another and found inside themselves. Romantic art also saw a return to Baroque-style theatricality, a longing for what seemed to be the simpler and more religious days of the Middle Ages, and a revulsion against the perceived ugliness of industrialization. Don't worry, we will see all of these in time. I usually save the summary slides for the end, but I started off with a summary of Romanticism because I'm going to backtrack and look at an artist whose career mirrored the move from aristocratic Rococo to Enlightenment rationalism to Romantic sublime and horror, and that artist is Goya. You've probably gathered I'm not crazy about David. I find his paintings brilliant but cold and fanatical. My opinion doesn't matter, except that you should probably be aware of my prejudices, and in that spirit, be warned that I really, really like Goya. Another man-crush alert. Francisco de Goya started out as a court painter. This painting is one of many designs he did for the royal tapestry works. His designs caught the eye of the Spanish royal family. Here we see Goya's famous portrait of Charles IV, his very bossy wife, who together with her lover really ruled Spain, and their many children. So just a few quick points of comparison with Velázquez's famous court portrait. We see similarities in the use of light and shadow, the paintings in the background, and the loose brushstrokes that brilliantly capture the sumptuous fabrics. But Las Meninas is all about the artist's intimacy with the royal family. Goya puts himself into the royal portrait as well, but he hides himself in the shadows. I've circled his face, since otherwise you could easily miss it. And maybe he was right to hide, because Goya barely bothered to disguise his disdain for his royal subjects. We know from Goya's writings that he found the Spanish royal family self-indulgent, irresponsible, and unprepared to meet the challenge that the French Revolution and then Napoleon's invasion would pose to Spain. So, are these Enlightenment works or are they Romantic works? The etching on the right used to show up all the time in the AP exam, hint, hint. It's been replaced with an etching from his other famous series, and we'll get there in a moment. But these are important transitional works in the move toward Romanticism, so I want to discuss them briefly. Goya's famous series marked a serious departure for the artist because they demonstrated his growing awareness of and agreement with the social and political changes that were sweeping across Europe. So here's what he wrote in his own newspaper advertisement for these prints. The subjects are chosen, quote, from the multitude of follies and blunders common in every civil society, as well as from vulgar prejudices and lies authorized by custom, ignorance, or interest. Those that he has thought most suitable matter for ridicule. The etching on the right, which is the most famous, seems to suggest that when reason sleeps, all sorts of terrible monsters emerge. So, it's a tribute to pure rationalism, right? Well, Goya wrote a caption for the print that complicates the message. The caption reads, "Imagination abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters. United with her, she is the mother of the arts and the source of their wonders." In other words, Goya believed that imagination should never be completely renounced in favor of the strictly rational. For Goya, art is the child that reason produces when it shacks up with imagination. One could argue that this etching gave birth to Romanticism as an art historical period, or at least it offered a profound justification for this new development. And then came Napoleon's invasion of Spain. The supposed standard-bearers of the Enlightenment themselves became violent tyrants, and the nightmares became a daily reality. No Goya oil painting made our list, and if you listen closely, you can probably hear howls from my fellow art history teachers. You'll recognize this painting, however, since it's all over your textbook. It's one of the most famous paintings in the history of art, and of course, a magnificent example of focal point, which is where you've seen it before. The video gives a little introduction to Napoleon's invasion of Spain, and that brings us to our required work. Goya painted the 3rd of May after Napoleon was driven from Spain and the new provisional government commissioned the work. During the Civil War itself, Goya did little painting, but he did make sketches of the horrors of war that he observed. Goya was actually invited to the front by one of the Spanish military leaders of the war against Napoleon. So these are eyewitness accounts, really the battlefield photography of the day. So let's watch one more video clip about the series and then look at this work in more detail. So what do you notice about the composition? We see another open composition with the newly executed man falling toward us into our space. The man tied to the pole is presumably soon to follow. But what really strikes me is the set of 3 guns peeking into the etching on the right, without the soldiers who undoubtedly are holding them. So this depicts war as a kind of dehumanizing machine. And it's not only the soldiers who are dehumanized by war. Here's another etching from the series, this time a group of Spanish women fiercely fighting to protect themselves and their children from a group of French soldiers. The images are unrelentingly horrible. We have rape and dismemberment and starvation and unrelenting death. Before I move on, let me talk about technique. You should be warned I am venturing way out of my comfort zone. This is where you would benefit from having an art teacher rather than a history teacher, but I'll try. The disasters of war are etchings, which means that the artist carved the basic design into wax or a similar substance on a metal plate and then poured on acid to eat into the uncovered metal. Etched lines are very clean because the acid removes exactly those parts of the plate where the ground had been scratched away. But Goya in this work combined etching with some other techniques, some old and some innovative. Engraving is an older print technique than etching. In this process, the artist carves lines into the copper using one of 2 traditional engraving tools, a burin or a dry point needle. I don't know if this helps, but I found these images on an art supply site. Isn't Google grand? The burin has tapered rectangular ends that are used to carve lines directly into the metal. In dry point, instead of removing the copper, the artist uses a dry point needle to push the copper up into a ridge, that is a burr, alongside the carved line, and this produces a softer, more textured line. Aquatint emerged as a printmaking process during Goya's lifetime. The artist applies a very fine dusting of powdered rosin, you see it here, to the etching plate. When the rosin dust is heated, it bonds to the metal plate, with each dust particle forming a speck of an area that resists acid. So the plane is then bitten in an acid bath, which produces a fine texture that will hold ink. Aquatint was an innovation because before, artists could only create fields of value, light and dark, by making hatched lines. Aquatint added an element of tone to prints. Variations in tone are created by varying how long different parts of the plate are exposed to the acid. It's called aquatint. See, the effect is rather like that of a watercolor. So I found this example of an aquatint from the earlier Goya series. Note the gradations of tone. In his old age, deaf and ill, Goya's visions became increasingly grim and macabre. Holed up in his farmhouse outside Madrid, he painted a series of murals on the walls of the farmhouse known as his black paintings. The most famous is Saturn devouring his children, perhaps the scariest painting that I have ever seen in person. It's ostensibly a very graphic illustration of the classical creation myth, but surely the real subject is the revolution devouring its own children. Remember Goya's rendering of Judith as a bloodthirsty revolutionary woman? This, too, was one of Goya's black paintings. Meanwhile, back in France, neoclassicism lived on in David's most famous student, Ingres. This canvas is nearly 17 feet long, a truly monumental work intended to awe and impress visitors to the French salon. Like Raphael's school of Athens, on which it's clearly based, Ingres' painting is a sacra conversazione, that is, a conversation between figures from different historical periods. This painting didn't make the list, and for once I have no complaints. I find Homer being crowned as king of literature a little creepy. But I want you to see this painting because our required painting is not entirely typical of Ingres' work. This is a much more interesting painting. to my mind at least, and it also shows that Romanticism was infecting even a die-hard neoclassicist such as Ingres. One of Napoleon's odder military adventures was an invasion of Egypt that did not end well. But Napoleon's exploits in North Africa and growing French trade with the region, which France would begin claiming as a colonies 15 years later, stimulated a great interest in the exotic Orient. And in this case, that meant North Africa. It didn't hurt that Europe was awash in romantic tales of Ottoman sultans with harems filled with lovelies, and it was considered okay to talk about and portray this kind of sex. These were not civilized Europeans or Christians, right? And of course, then as now, sex sold. Basically, Ingres used the exotic setting, much as Renaissance painters used mythological settings, to give their nude paintings a cloak of respectability and a distance from the viewer. That is all going to change. Stay tuned for Monet. So here's a later Orientalist painting by Ingres. Note he still had a thing for backs, and those backs, interestingly, had 2 or 3 more vertebrae than any physiologist would be able to find in an autopsy. So, Orientalism is the romantic element of this painting, but really the odalisque represents a mishmash of styles with a lot of shout-outs to earlier eras. Ingres was a huge fan of Raphael. The Ingres painting, the Ingres painting on the right, painted the same year as our required work, shows Raphael with his mistress. We see Mannerist elements as well, especially in the exaggerated length of the body. But we don't see. What comparison am I teeing up with this detail from Goya's 3rd of May? We don't see loose brushstrokes or evocative use of color that will characterize many romantic works. Ingres is all about subdued color and the use of line. Also, Ingres and most French Academy painters prided themselves on producing virtually invisible brushstrokes. The act of painting itself was disguised. Romantic and then modernist painters would make the involvement of the painter much more obvious and explicit, a term that would come to be called painterly. So I'm going to end today's lecture with 2 French painters who, more than any others, have really come to define Romanticism, Théodore Géricault and Eugène Delacroix. There were more past AP test questions on this painting than on any other from this period, but the painting is nevertheless dropped from the list, and then it showed up on the AP test as a Romanticism attribution question. Delacroix was a friend of Géricault's. Géricault actually used Delacroix as the model for the corpse I've circled here. Note the repeated use of compositional pyramids, very common in Romantic as well as Baroque painting. And you will see a feature in Liberty Leading the People. Géricault also employs a very open composition. The painting is spilling out of its canvas and into our space. Note that this puts us among the corpses. So does Liberty Leading the People. So I'm going to show you some other Delacroix paintings in my second lecture on Romanticism, but today we'll end here with our required work and the work that made Delacroix famous, and perhaps the most iconic of all French paintings. The occasion for the painting was the Revolution of 1830. That's the revolution described in Les Miserables, by the way. The revolution succeeded in bringing down the French monarchy for good, and bringing in a more liberal and bourgeois branch of the French royal family, actually the Bourbon monarchy, I should say, but not quite liberal enough to stomach such a revolutionary painting. It would be decades before revolution became old news, and the figure, now dubbed Marianne, would become the symbol of France. So we'll close with as much of this excellent video clip as you have time for.